no security problem passing an ID as long as it's treated as an ID, or you do other things. But again, this isn't going to be a talk about every information security control. It's going to be more of a you'll see what it's getting towards. So importantly enough, checks and websites, they all have inputs, right? They let attackers in both scenarios control details, and it's up to you as the end recipient to make sure that that doesn't go wrong. So in terms of problems, again, most of these things we saw on the screen are all related to SQL injection. That's how most of these attacks happen. You already saw my spiel. So in the case of the news article, it passed an ID, but I passed in extra SQL statement to get something I wanted. In the case of the check, we had a valid check, and then I passed in extra information to get you more money. So in both scenarios, it's pretty much a pretty good analogy, if you will. Both the cases, though, just fall down to if you had looked for the things you should have looked for, this would have never happened, basically. So we'll skip the anecdote and get back to that later. So there's some other attacks, and again, just some high-level things. Local file inclusion is when I, as an attacker, say you are asking, you are letting me control, like, I want to include an image. I can control what file gets included. You think it's going to be an image. You always think it's supposed to be an image. Unless you're validating that I'm passing in an image to be requested, I can pass in the password file of the system. I can pass in the history of a bash terminal. I can pass in whatever's in scope to me as the attacker through your web server. I can then ask for that file and include it. Local file deletion works the same way. You expect to delete a file. So let's say it's let's say you have like a little website that allows you to upload files like a photo gallery. And you can upload files, and with the mechanism to delete a file, I can specify to delete any file within the scope of like the Apache web user, for instance. If I'm running the Apache web server, that's running probably, not always, but probably as the Apache user. And in that case, if Apache owns that file to delete it, I can delete it for you. What we see a lot when I'm doing vulnerability cleanups, or I should say, compromise cleanups due to a vulnerability, what I see a lot of time is the attacker will delete the original vulnerability that they found. If they upload, like, say, let's like a backdoor, for lack of a better term. They upload one, they use that and pivot, they delete that one with the existing vulnerability, and then they keep chaining, so it's hard for me to track down which is the current vulnerability, or which is the current backdoor, or there was one system I worked on that had vulnerabilities spanning 3 years ago to present. Every couple of months, a new vulnerability would get dropped using the same or one of the ones up the chain. So it's hard to track those down because you start looking through log files, but you can't find any log files of how they broke in. That's because they broke in like 20 chains ago, and now it's like, well, how do I figure out which one was where and how that... So it's a really hard thing to get around. That's why local file deletion is important. Auth bypass, much more simply than having to brute force passwords or anything else, phish people, just bypassing authentication altogether. Kind of the token example I give in one of the published vulnerabilities I have, someone used cookies as the validation mechanism. Yeah. If you're not aware, cookies are client-side. You as a computer control a cookie. Now, there are ways to get around that, that's outside the scope with crypto and stuff. But the important part is, if you have a cookie that says admin, and then you have a flag that's 1, yeah, things go very poorly very quickly in that case. And that's a real vulnerability in a real app, unfortunately. And then crypto, it's a huge topic. There's a lot of misconceptions about how to do crypto, how to do password crypto correctly. We're going to address a little bit of that at the end, just because I think it's super important for anyone. So defending input, validated, and or sanitized, it is the minimum level you should be doing for any of this stuff. For example, we were talking about the news ID. If the news ID is an ID and the ID is an integer, if it's not an integer, you make it an integer. If it breaks the site, too bad, but it won't make the site vulnerable. So if someone passes in bad characters and it's like, oh, I give you an error now, who cares? They got an error. They're not looking for anything valid. It's not like they're a real user that's going to be upset at you. They're trying to attack the site. So in the case of this, if you take a number, cast it to an integer, it'll always be an integer. You can never attack a site like that. So that's super important. So third-party products, web application firewalls, if you're in the Linux space, Mod Security 2 is free but very painful thing to use. If you have some money at your business, again, like Barracuda does have a really good web application firewall. You just have to make sure you keep it turned on, unlike them. So Duo Security, I brought up in my last talk, I'll bring them up in this talk and every other talk I basically give. So they're Ann Arbor-based. Two-factor authentication, if you guys heard about the AP breach, you probably saw a billion articles after saying, why didn't they have two-factor? And if you're not familiar with two-factor, we used to go down this crazy road of like biometrics and all this other shit. The reality is almost everyone in this room probably has a cell phone. If you have a cell phone, you have a device that can keep on you pretty much all the time. And if you couple that with a passphrase, it's going to be very hard for an attacker who's phishing you to get your account stolen. Or if you leave your password on a Post-it note, it doesn't matter as long as you have your phone with you still. So there are all these attacks that we've been getting hit by, and all these simple things that are hard to defend because people are still making terrible passwords, or they're leaving their passwords written somewhere, or they're getting compromised and they brute force your password from one site, and then you reuse it on a different site, and now they've owned two sites, right? Yes?
Well, that was something that Google promoted very heavily when Matt Honan got hacked.
So Google has their Authenticator program, which there's a blog post at Duo Security about how the implementation of Google Authenticator was flawed, and that's a much larger discussion for a different day. What's cool about Duo versus like a Google is Duo you sign up for as a service, right? Just like Google. However, A, it's not Google. B, it's Ann Arbor based. C, it's ran by John Overheim and Doug Song, who if you don't know who they are, you probably should just Google them and find out. But what's important is they built SDKs for those many languages and about 100 different integrations. So if you have blogs, if you have Outlook, if you have Windows logins, if you have SSH, they have code open source ready to go to pop into your environment or build your own solution around their solution. And it's all cryptographically based in such a way that no data you're transmitting to them is ever just secret data. You never give them your password. You do your authentication normal, and then the two-factor route will do something like, it'll push a notification to my phone that says from Dearborn, Michigan, this IP, this username is trying to log into this IP, yes or no. So if someone brute forces your password, tries to log into your SSH server, I will get a push saying someone's trying to log in with my password and username. And I can just say no, because I'm not doing it, right? It also supports things like SMS. You can get hardware tokens if you really like your RSA Secure ID token, if that's something important to you. They have all these different ways to integrate it. And up to 10 users, for them, it's 100% free. Not 10 integrations, not 10 sites, not 10 Drupals, 10 users. So if you have a small entity or just a small admin team, you can literally put two-factor on every single device in your corporation for free just by using them as a service. So there's my pitch for the day. And the reason I harp on it more than just they're great guys and they're locals is really it does work, and I've been using them for years and it's amazing. So here's something to think about, and I know some of you have something in your mind and you'll see it on the next title slide, but if we look at this and we look at years of education, if we look at what you've gone through to be a web programmer, it's pretty dissimilar from any of those things out there. So apples and oranges, right? Like, this is bullshit. Why are you talking about this, Mark? That's completely wrong. All of them deal with a lot of data. If you've ever been in the financial sector, if you ever worked in the medical field, you know how much regulation and bullshit you put up with on a day-to-day basis. The thing you don't realize is, and the thing I realize is by breaking into companies that hire us, is the people developing the websites holding that information are not treating it with the same respect as you probably had to at your job. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll go over some of those today. In each profession, like a doctor, Hippocratic Oath, right? My wife is a pharmacist. If she lost your information, if she doesn't lose her license, she's not going to be working in the state of Michigan very long. People in the healthcare field are, it depends on the level of the healthcare field, of course, but they're treated with kind of not a one and done mentality, not a three strikes mentality, but it's somewhere in the middle. There's not a lot of room to work in and fail at your job when it comes to patient healthcare or financial data. Yep.
I work for a healthcare system in the area, and it is an immediate fireable offense if you cause a HIPAA violation. Immediate, on the spot, no, you could try to appeal, but before it's done after you, you're gone.
Yeah. Coming in or? No, all right. So I think most people would agree that each career, I don't care if you're building houses or you're writing web apps, there are certain moral and ethical obligations everyone has, whether you're protecting someone's safety by building a home the correct way, not cutting corners, not buying the cheapest steel you can buy, whatever the case is, right? There are certain things everyone does in each career, not spitting in food if you do fast food. You don't do them, and you know not to do them for various reasons. Pick your political stance, your religion, your family upbringing, I don't care what the reason is. But at some point, if it's not done on the ground up, we do top down, especially in this country, where we regulate the fuck out of it if it's not done automatically, right? So that's where SOX, that's where Gramm-Leach-Bliley, that's where HIPAA, that's where PCI, on and on and on, right? That's what we get. So everyone makes mistakes. Everyone will always make mistakes. Bad things happen to good people, on and on, right? With web developers, there really isn't much of a punishment. For the kind of data that web developers are tasked with, and the kind of applications they're building, they are not treated with the same regard when it comes to failing at their job as anyone else within that information security field, in my context. I'll kind of place it. It's not even close to being even. So web programmers, and this may or may not be something that you're aware of, but I mean, web programmers, if you're not on a really, really large team, a lot of web programmers are probably the web programmer, the DBA, and the sysadmin. I think some of us have all been there at some certain companies one way or another, right? So the amount of trust you are given as a web developer is often pretty much unfettered because they're like, well, we need you to integrate this database with making a website. Well, I can't do that unless I have the database, right? Which should be the answer is, well, no, we can give you full fake data and then you can connect it to the product environment. But that doesn't happen like you think it should or would. What does happen is that the developer gets full access to the data because they are connecting the data and the website. And when that happens, anything they write is effectively letting me as an attacker go in and dictate how I want things to occur if they've given me enough leeway to do so. Checks and balances in web development, I mean, if you have a manager, that's probably pretty common. You'll probably have a manager. But in terms of management, they're not going to be managing you and doing code reviews usually. They're going to be saying, is your project on time? Does your project work? That's what managers are for, and there's a good reason for those roles. However, when it comes to security, when it comes to important data, when it comes to web development, a lot of things are still pretty flighty for most organizations, especially small ones. Documentation, not in the sense like this function does X. Documentation is, why do you allow data to traverse from A to B? Why does data sit here in a temp space for 5 hours until it gets cleared? Why does this happen? Those questions don't get asked in the same way. Like if my wife put drugs on the counter and walked away, her boss would say, well, A, you're fired, but B, why the hell did you put drugs on the table where someone could grab it? Those questions don't come up in the same way they would in other parts of the professional field of similar content. The information, I think control logic is probably the best way to put it. The logic of the application dictates how information flows in and out. If you do not secure the logic flow, you can ask for data in that you weren't expecting, and you can get out data that you weren't expecting. And web developers, when they're connecting to these production databases, so you log into your healthcare provider to look to see what your statements are for that month. That's coming from a database, and there was a web developer who built that. And whether or not they did a good job is up to me to find out, usually. And the last line down there says, in most cases, they've never been taught to do any of this. They've never been trained to do any of this.
Who's they? The
developers.
Oh, developers.
Us. They just know how to code. They haven't been through the.
It's so common to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're a web developer, we need a website. We have no idea what you do. Go do stuff.
Yeah, that's the thing is you have somebody who's at the hospital or the bank who doesn't understand coding and the parameters. They just know we need a website.
Does it look like that? Good. You're done. Awesome. Yeah, exactly. It's so
the development firms should be securing the authority.
well, development firms are a thing, but you might not have a development firm doing work for your company. You might just have a developer at your company. So then who's it on? So the reality is, and if you guys have been to college or you're a web developer or some part of the Venn diagram, you realize that there's not 4-year degrees in web development. development, web programming. You can get a computer science degree, you can get an information assurance degree, you can get CIS, you can get, but there's no web development degree. We have dozens of language, we have dozens of backends, we have dozens of middleware, we have dozens, but we don't have a degree, which you could very easily fill a 4-year degree with just web development, no problem, right? And then the other part is, so full disclosure, I built 2 Linux courses and taught at Eastern Michigan University. I also taught at ITT Tech for 1 horrible semester. And, it's one of those things that if you go to certain universities, you'll still see like people like, oh, maybe Fortran, we should teach that. Like the thing is that people just don't. Curriculum is very hard to change, very hard to change, and it's not just because your department has a dick. It's because the actual changing of curriculum has to go through a much bigger process than you could ever imagine. It goes way higher than you would ever think it goes to get curriculum changed. So courses in web development. If you do have a course in web dev, it's probably like, here's HTML, here's CSS, maybe here's some PHP MySQL, maybe here's some Rails, whatever. Maybe you'll have a slide on security or a day on security. But with as much data as we're pushing through these systems, is it too much to ask for at least a class? Now I do know, I want to say Davenport and U of M and one other school on the west side that I can't think of, they have full computer security courses, but again, that's computer security, not web application program. Yeah.
Michigan Tech has network security courses as well in their computer science program that anyone who's taking any computer science degree can take.
Yes.
Can take or has to
I
take?
took one.
Can take.
Well,
One's a 4,000, one's a 5,000 level course, so they're not till the end of the
Yeah,
program.
yeah. Web would be. I would be super impressed if there was a web application security class anywhere.
I was gonna say network security is a lot different than application
Yeah.
security.
But they cover how the applications can misuse a network, and so it does cover some of this stuff.
Yeah, but it's hard. It's hard, and there are a lot of commonalities between languages, and there are a lot of commonalities between vulnerabilities in web application languages, especially. The problem is that the nuances between each one, unless you are at a school that teaches like Ruby on Rails for a program, and then you have an entire course just on Ruby on Rails security, you're going to miss something. I guarantee you. And even people that think they're doing PHP correctly, I can show you vulnerabilities in PHP that you think are not even real things, and you're like, holy crap, I thought I was protecting against that. And it's very hard to do security well if you're not using frameworks and technologies to prevent you from doing bad things. Doing it yourself, it's very hard to do. So bachelor degree, if there is, I mean, it's going to be computer science, it's going to be a course, it's not going to be a whole program. So it's not just web applications, it's not just education necessarily. So by the age of 22, I had web applications, full web apps, not like my personal web page. I had full web apps on 2 university campuses within Michigan, and each of those was public to the internet. No one reviewed anything. We had no process, no one asked me questions, no one asked me credentials, no one asked me what my background in web development is, no one asked me if I knew what I was doing, no one even asked if I thought I knew what I was doing. I said, hey, I have a web app, my department wants me to put this on the web, can you give me space for that and then give me a host name? And it was no big deal. I've never even taken a web programming course. I've been developing a very long time, but I've never taken a course in web programming. And the reality is, and the most important part of this whole thing is, I am not the exception. This is not weird, this is not strange. I am the rule to how things work, not just in education, but in the industry as a whole. These things happen way more commonly than you would ever want to know about. I stopped telling my wife about the things I find, especially medically related, because she's just so depressed about how bad everything is. So I think to some of your points over here, most people don't know what web apps are doing. They know what web apps look like. They know how a web app functions in the general sense. So especially if you have a manager, and especially if it's a non-technical manager, they want to know, does it look the right way? Does it have the graphic in the right place? Are your pixels aligned correctly? Those things matter to people because they are making assumptions about if it works, it must be okay. Because there are a lot of things in life that do work that way, generally speaking. And with web application development, if something works, it does not mean it's going to work the right way, nor does it mean it's safe, nor does it mean X, Y, or Z. There are a lot of assumptions made, and I don't know whose fault that part is, and that can be a huge debate, but there are a lot of assumptions made, and we need to take assumptions out of the equation where we can, and put in fact reality checking. So experienced coders, if anyone's a developer here, you've made concessions in your code. You've got stuff out the door. You've hit that deadline at all costs because you were either afraid to get fired or someone's going to yell at you or whatever the case. The inexperienced developer, they're making those mistakes because they don't know any better. They're not trying to be malicious. They're not trying to, cause problems. And maybe they're putting their heart and soul into these projects, but they don't know any better than not to do a certain thing a certain way, which causes a vulnerability, right? So this is really the magnum opus of this whole talk. We need to change things. And the idea and the thing that frustrates me the most, and we have to stop, is this idea that this one problem or this one technology or this one thing will fix the problem. The knowledge, the education, the training of people to know that there are technologies to fix the problem, that is the solution to all of this. We have the technologies to solve these problems. We have technologies to solve them in very elegant ways, and we don't know to use them, or we don't know how to use them in the right way. So if you're managers, you need to establish security standards for your company. If you don't know what security standards should look like, I'll throw a link up later. There's an organization called OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project. OWASP is a 501(c)(3). They've been around for a number of years. They have a number of projects they do as a community. It's all community open source. There's an entire wiki, community driven, with here's a language, here are security issues, here's how you fix them. There's knowledge out there, and so if you're a manager that doesn't know what they're doing, there is information out there to build a security program around your development if you so choose. Auditing is super important though, and I'm not saying that as an auditor, I'm saying that as the only way you can ever know that you're doing well is to find out if you're doing well. You can make assumptions, but unless you have someone auditing you, the assumptions don't really hold a lot of weight other than, oh, we think we're doing well. Developers, this one to me is the easiest part of this whole equation. If you have once a week someone gives a presentation on something about security they learned that week, or if you have someone go through OWASP and say, here's a cool page I found, let me give you a 5-minute presentation about it during lunch. And more importantly, if you're a developer and you're on a team, you should be trying to own each other's code left and right. There's no better feeling than putting what's still hip and cool. Harlem Shake's dead, right? Is that out of Let's just use Harlem Shake. If you put Harlem Shake video in the news feed of some website that your co-developer is working on, that would be awesome. Come on. There are whole capture the flag competitions on the internet that are driven on the predicate that by doing something with a team, by learning together, by finding security vulnerabilities, you'll be better equipped to do that and prevent that in your real life, and it's also fun to do. So whatever the mentality of your company needs to be, however, whether you're a corporation, a startup, whatever, focus on making and the gamification of this, right? You have web apps, he has web apps, trying to break each other's web apps, right? This should be pretty straightforward for a lot of teams. And educators, does anyone teach in here at collegiate level? Okay. Well, pass this on if you're a student or if you know educators. It's a very long process, like I said, for most places to develop curriculum and get it passed through all the hierarchy that has to get passed through. Start now, start working with people like OWASP, find community members. Another thing to point out, there is an OWASP Detroit chapter. It comes out of Royal Oak every quarter. It's a free meeting, no dues, no nothing like that. If you Google OWASP Detroit, OWASP, you will find the site, you'll find the information about the meetings, and that's just a time you can come together, talk to people, see a presentation, and discuss web application security. Yeah?
What's the name of that?
OWASP, OWASP.
Oh,
So what I was talking about earlier, where if we don't do it from the ground up, we're going to get it done to us top down, right? In 2011, there was legislation. This legislation eventually died by, lame ducks or whatever the cause for legislation dying arbitrarily. Just like CISPA and anything else, right? It's going to be back. It's going to keep coming back. Someone's going to think this is a great new idea and try to charge it through further state or whatever reason. Here is what this legislation looked like, though. That's the important part, is to start thinking about how this stuff reads. So require businesses with personal information, what that means, who knows, of more than 10,000 customers to implement privacy and security programs, what that means, no one knows, to ensure the safety of pertinent data. Okay, so that's straightforward. And then if there's a violation, $5,000 per violation per day with a maximum of $20 million per violation. So So that is literal, that was in Congress at one point, and if it doesn't look like that the next time around, it's probably gonna be worse, just like all the stuff we deal with on a daily basis. So the industry. This is where the unpopular ideas start. I'm sorry, if you broke into websites every day for medical companies and insurance companies and mortgage companies, you would start calling for some of this stuff too, I guarantee. Medical, finance, government, and commerce. If you are a developer in those industries, you need to be licensed as a web developer in those industries. What licensing gets to the point to is the same thing that why my wife is getting licensed in part, which is if she does something very, very, very negligent, unethical, bad, that will track with her the rest of her life. Now I'm not saying I wish that upon my wife and I couldn't get her out of something bad she did, but come on, nepotism aside, right? If this is your information, you're dealing with 20,000, 50,000, 200,000 people's personal information. If you do something negligent, you probably should actually have to face something for that. In every other industry,
You could ruin someone's life, literally.
many lives very quickly, right? How many dumps of personal information are on Pastebin every single day, right? This isn't funny anymore. I mean, it's funny when someone like makes a funny joke on it on Twitter, but as soon as your personal information comes up on someone's Pastebin, let me know how funny it is and how long that lasts. Most importantly for the licensing is that part, which we just discussed. So certifications are complete bullshit. I have a lot of certifications because I have to. So what the certification does is create a minimum level of entry into any single thing, right? That's what a certification is for. If we had to have everyone take a certification for, let's say, $100, and to be a web developer at one of these entities, you at least had to do the certification that had all the security crap on it and pass it. Worst case scenario, they cheat their way through it, but they probably learned something by cheating. If you're ever cheated on an exam in high school, you know what I mean. You're like starting to write these notes on your hand, and like, oh wait, I already knew that. Like I don't even have to read my hand anymore. So I'm okay with people cheating. I want people to learn. The certification isn't to verify they know what they're doing. It's to force them into learning passively or actively. However the job gets done, learn something more than you knew the day before you went to work. The other thing it does is if you want to be a professional in an industry, if you can't pay $100, and I know that's hard for college students, I understand that, money, all those things. If you can't pay $100 to do something as a profession, how much do you really want to do that as a profession, right? We pay $50,000, $100,000 to go to college. We can drop $100 or $200 to get a certification to say we're a web developer, right? So again, they're not popular, but things have gotten out of hand. They've probably been out of hand a long time, but I think things are getting more publicized. I think the information dissemination is much easier than it ever used to be. We can publish gigs of personal data now, and you can download it in like a half hour. The ability to transfer people's information, their private data, is just increasingly growing faster and easier, right? All this between Torney, between things like RapidShare, getting information out there and walking away as the guy who did the bad deed and never getting tagged is a lot easier than it ever used to be. So we need to protect on the site side, not being prosecuting people's fine, right? If bad people do bad things, prosecute them, right? That's not going to solve the problem, though. We need to solve the problem and not just keep hacking away at the 14-year-old kids doing this shit. So quick story time. I've got about 10 or I don't think someone speaks after me. So I've got 10 minutes. So just to scare you guys all into submission for all of my ideas. So the first one, medical reimbursement. There was a SQL injection on that site. No big deal in terms of trying to find it. It was very easy to find. This medical reimbursement company, if you've ever, well, I can't say if you've ever, but people that get coupons online to give their drug from $11 billion to $100. If you've ever had one of those coupons, this may have gone through the company that I breached into for work. And I had all the social security numbers for everyone. I had all their HIPAA data. I even knew what ailments they had in terms of HIPAA data. I knew if they had cancer or diabetes because I knew which drugs they were looking for the reimbursement. So that's not good, right? Medical insurance. This was a very, 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 very large medical insurance company. That's all I'm going to say. Their entire site was bulletproof. You could tell they did everything top to bottom, left to right. And I have this litany of Hail Mary types things I do at the very end of every assessment when I'm about to just give up and go home and drink a beer. And one of them worked, which if you couldn't guess by the description is type /admin as a URL. I went to the site, typed /admin as a path, and I logged in as the admin. There was no authentication whatsoever.
Wow.
That's how I felt. It got worse though. So I saw all the PII, I saw all the information for everyone. But what got worse is, if anyone's a developer, I'm not trying to exclude people now, but if you ever done